Good morning and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amanda Ellis and we're so glad you tuned in for this special webcast regarding our professional growth and evaluation system, or personnel evaluation system. Still all about growth. But I have here with me Robin Abear. Good morning. And Robin and I are going to be sharing with you the next steps, things to be thinking about as we prepare for implementing the new system and helping to support districts develop their certified evaluation plan that provides the flexibility that's offered in the change in the statute, but also things to be thinking about now. Before we get started, I want to make sure you look at the bottom of your screen and you'll see the Go Soapbox website. Of course, our password is OTL, and we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions if you have them throughout this webcast and things that we may be able to answer. So thanks for tuning in, and let's get started. So today you're going to notice that our focus is not on the entire system. Rather, it's about the measures, performance criteria, and evidences. And this is a little bit different than what we've had in the past, but there's a lot of the same fundamental pieces. So if you will, look at the questions that we're going to focus on today. So this is really aimed at providing you some things to be thinking about, some information to dig into as you start to look at your certified evaluation plan and you prepare for the decisions, the big decisions your 50-50 committee has to make. The first one that we want you to be thinking about as we go through the information today is, what are the current evidences in your certified evaluation plan aligned to the criteria and achieve the goals for evaluation and growth of teachers, your other professionals, and principals? And that means whatever's in your CEP now. So whether you kept it the same or changed it this year, are they really aligned to the criteria? The other piece about that is, what other evidences could you consider including in your CEP? Meaning, are there evidences that and practices that your district currently uses that you could incorporate that as evidences that you've always wanted to, and when we had a statewide system, things that would align to the criteria that we use to provide evidences when you go to the point of having to rate. And then, of course, how can the district ensure that the sources of evidence provide enough information to address the performance criteria? Ultimately, we want you to have a system that is sustainable, that is defensible, that is fair. And so it's going to be really important that you have a really strong understanding of what those measures are, what evidence is that you could align the criteria to those measures, and what we use for sure. So I'm going to turn it over to Robin to get us going with how we get started.
Okay. So the first thing, excuse me, that we wanted to do was a little bit of review and reflection on the last webcast that we had. We wanted to go back over the proposed definition of the personnel evaluation system, which is to support and improve the performance of certified school personnel, and to use clear and timely feedback, formative feedback, to guide professional growth. And this definition provides a strong look at the purposes of the personnel evaluation system. Again, that is to evaluate the professional effectiveness of educators and to promote professional growth. We want to be sure that we stay focused on those purposes as we talk through the webcast today. You might remember that we shared this graphic with you in last week's webcast. I wanted to remind you that we had met with the Teacher Effectiveness Steering Committee, the Principal Effectiveness Steering Committee, the local superintendent's advisory councils, and had lots of feedback from the field that provided overwhelming support for the continued use of the Kentucky Framework for Teaching, the specialist frameworks, as well as our current principal performance standards. And so you'll see here and throughout the webcast that we have many references to these documents, which we consider to be foundational in defining what effective educators know and do. And so I just wanted to remind you of this graphic and to have you look back. You also may remember that last week we focused on and introduced the 4 measures that are proposed in this new regulation, which include planning, environment, instruction, and professionalism. We will talk a lot more about those throughout this webcast, but I did want to call your attention to that because it is a new part of the framework. So we also have in this graphic in addition to the measures, the criteria which for teachers and other professionals are the Kentucky Framework for Teaching, the Specialist Framework, for principals, the Principal Performance Standard, and then the evidences which would be determined by the local district. And so again, we'll talk a lot more about this, but I wanted to just remind you of some things that we talked about as we talked about last time. We also wanted to just quickly review the Kentucky Revised Statute 156.557, one section of it that really addresses the measures that are to be identified in the new framework for personnel evaluation. And you can see on the screen some of the requirements or the criteria for the measures, but I wanted to especially call your attention to F, which says that the new framework would be used to inform personnel decisions. So in addition to the evaluation of certified personnel and the support for continuous professional growth, we also have that that this system be used to inform personnel decisions. So just a little review of what the actual statute calls out. And as we go through the webcast today, please be thinking about your 50-50 committee and all of the information that the 50-50 committee needs to be focused on and aware of as you're thinking through any potential changes to your CEPs.
Great. So we're going to move on and look at the actual performance measure. So in that statute that it stated, one of the very first criteria are multiple measures. And so we've been very intentional to go based on the recommendations of the Principal Steering Committee to really honor the criteria that people seem to like the most, the very descriptive attributes of teachers, other professionals, and principals. And so what we've done is align with the criteria 4 measures that are already identified. Now what the districts are going to have to do is the hard part. And they're going to have to figure out what evidences go along. But the 4 measures that are going to be used that in the proposed regulation is planning, environment, instruction, and professionalism. And so you'll notice that it's very similar to the domains of the teachers and other professionals. And then we align the standards of the principals with these 4 measures. And so if you remember the definition of the performance criteria are the areas, skills, or outcomes of which certified school personnel are evaluated. So the criteria used in those frameworks will help define what exactly is what you're looking for, what skills you want to observe or to collect evidence on. The other piece to remember is the source of evidence is the district determined, so this is up to you, evidences that are going to be aligned to the performance measure and used by evaluators to inform those ratings. Now we're going to not talk about ratings today because that's a whole other set of decisions, but it's really important that you're not just choosing evidence that you've always done without it being aligned, because ultimately your measures are what really is aligned to the criteria. It's not the actionable evidences. So we got to really be very careful about that, that when we observe, we're not rating an observation, but we're aligning that to the criteria that's listed in the framework. So we're going to go over an example of that. So if you look on the screen, you'll see the teacher performance measures over planning, environment, instruction, and professionalism. You can see where it's aligned to the Domain 1, Planning and Preparation, Domain 2, Classroom Environment, Domain 3, Instruction, Domain 4, Professional Responsibilities. Now, as you probably already know, after using the Danielson Framework for the past several years, planning and preparation does not just mean a lesson plan. It is really about getting to know your students, their context in which they live, their culture, setting goals for students. How do you assess students for learning? There's quite a robust setting for each one of these domains. So one of the examples we're going to use is what you currently have in your CEP. In a Domain 3 instruction, one of the evidences that we've used and have used for years is observation. And so with observation, you're not just walking in and observing to mark off an overall rating about instruction. Rather, this is Domain 3. And you can see that it has several indicators of instruction. And so if you look, A, B, C, D, and E, They have multiple skills that are expected during instruction, from communicating with students, questioning and discussion, engaging students in learning, using assessment in instruction, demonstrating flexibility and responsiveness. Many of these things can be observed and data collected through observation. There may be other things that you may want to choose to use as evidence. The other piece you need to be thinking about as well is the evidences that you choose may not just be for one measure. It could fit in for other measures. But what you need to really think about is, how does it truly align? So if you're going in to observe, what are you observing? What are you looking for? And how does that align to the criteria that is outlined in the framework? Robin, I think you have the next example.
So we wanted to provide an example from the different role groups that are included in personal evaluation. So we'll look at another example from the other professional frameworks, and we're going to look specifically at library media specialists. So again, you can see from the library media specialist framework, the domain 1, planning and preparation, aligns to the measure of planning. Domain 2, the environment, aligns to environment and the performance measures. Domain 3, delivery of service, aligns to instruction. And Domain 4, professional responsibilities, aligns to professionalism. So we want to consider the type of evidence that you might think about for professional responsibilities. So let's take a look at Domain 4 and what the Library Media Specialist Framework says about professional responsibilities. You can see here, reflecting on practice, maintaining accurate records, communicating with school staff and community. It goes on and on. Many different indicators there for how a library media specialist would demonstrate professional responsibilities. So you might think about how a log of workshops or courses taken by a library media specialist might be a good evidence for the growing and developing professionally. For a library media specialist to have evidence of their own professional growth, that might be something that you would look for. But you also might want to consider that under professional ethics and knowing about copyright law and the ethical use of information, that these logs of workshops or courses might be insufficient for evidence for the entirety of this domain. And so you really want to think about not just the source of evidence, one source of evidence for each domain, but you also want to think about the breadth of that evidence, and does it really give an accurate and full picture of a library media specialist's adherence to professional responsibility. So just a lot to think about as you're considering the evidences for your different role groups.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the last example we're going to use, just to give you an idea, is, again, you can see the 4 measures: planning, environment, instruction, and professionalism. So how it works for principals is a little bit different, because as you know, there were 6 standards in the past, and this is what we're recommending again. So you would see that in each measure, there are standards that are aligned. So the one we're going to look at for principals as an example is environment. So with Standard 2 and Standard 5, even though it's not structured the same as the Danielson framework and how they've laid out their teacher and other professionals, we do have standards that go along with what's expected of the principal using James Strong work. So in environment, clearly that's more of a school environment, community, communications. And so if you look at Standard 2 and Standard 5, you have what the principal is expected to do: foster the success of all students by developing, advocating, sustaining academically rigorous, positive, safe school climate. Clearly, this is pretty robust, and it's something that's going to have some evidence that really can capture what's going on with the school climate, how the principal's leading that change or fostering the success of students, as well as Standard 5. It's also about environment with our communication and community relationship with our shareholders. How do they foster the success of students with communicating with families and different people who are invested in the students? And so just to show you an example, there are many indicators around school climate. So when you're thinking about evidences that would align with environment, what could you use? It could be a student survey. It could be teacher survey. There could be TEL. There could be a community feedback piece. You could also have site visits. You know, as we have now, there are lots of things to think through. How do you capture the work of the principal, the evidences, to inform how will the supervisor be informed by the evidences to really make a fair rating based on the measure of environment. You'll notice that 5 also has several indicators of what's expected of principals through communication, advocacy, how they plan, how they incorporate community and parents. This is a big lift, and so how do you capture the voices of those shareholders to really paint the picture of what the principal is or is not doing, and even identify areas of growth? So what evidences would be sound for that? And remember, the evidences that we're talking about here are not boxes of collection of stuff. We don't recommend that. That's part of the issue with people assuming more paperwork, but thinking through what are sound evidences that you may already do. If you survey students and that's a practice that you want to continue, that can certainly be a source of evidence. If you receive feedback from parents every year about how they can best be communicated with or how they feel like they're a part of the school community, those are evidences that could be considered if that's what you deem as reliable and could help inform ratings. So, Robin?
Okay. So we wanted to just take a 40,000-foot look again at this collection so that you can see, again, the performance measures that go across the top of the screen: planning, environment, instruction, and professionalism. And then as you move down through the different rows, you can see the role groups and what performance criteria has been included in the proposed regulation. So for teachers, it's the Kentucky Framework for Teaching. For other professionals, it's the specialist frameworks. And for principals, it's the principal performance standards. And again, just to give you a snapshot view of how this works for all of the different role groups and what has been proposed in the regulation. And again, you know, reflecting on the entire webcast, we're thinking about evidence for each one of these measures and how you can capture really meaningful evidence that teachers, other professionals, and principals are meeting these standards set forth in the performance criteria. So just a snapshot of the whole system. Now, what we'd like to do is reflect again on the questions.
Mm-hmm. And so as we're going back to the questions where we started this webcast, one of the things, as you all are starting to dig into your current evidences in your certified evaluation plan, how they align to the criteria and achieve the goals for evaluation and growth of teachers, other professionals, and principals. One of the things I would really encourage you to do is, if you are not familiar with the frameworks, if you have not dug into the criteria, they are not lightweight documents. They're quite robust, full of attributes, and we really, really encourage you to provide those documents to your 50/50 committee. It is very difficult to make decisions based on titles because there's so much breadth and depth into the criteria that outlines the detailed and very difficult work of teachers, very difficult work of other professionals and principals or administrators. And so if that is not fully understood, it's going to be hard for you to make decisions on appropriate evidences. So that's one thing I would definitely encourage you to do, is have that available, walk through the criteria, making sure that your 50/50 committee is fully aware of the tools that are being recommended. The other thing is, think about other evidences that you could you consider including in your CEP. There are lots of great practices that districts use every day that we would encourage you to think through. And many of those evidences is not just about a rating. It is about growth. You know, that was the purpose of the peer observation. It was never as a got you, but it was really as an opportunity for feedback. That can certainly be included. The student voice, however you capture that, that's a definite consideration. But each evidence that's considered, the next thing you'll have to think about, which we'll talk about, are logistics. How often? What's the frequency? When does it happen? And so really be realistic with your evidences. You don't want a system that's so difficult that you can't fulfill procedurally your CEP, but we also want it to be meaningful for you. And then, of course, how can the district ensure that sources of evidence provide enough information to address the performance criteria? We have many people in this interim time call and ask, can I just use an observation? No. It's really not enough evidence for you to have a defensible system. So really think about the evidences that you use. We don't put a number on it. It's really up to the districts, but it must align to the criteria. And so I do have a few questions that we have, and we will definitely address those. One of the questions which we did not address today, but we will, but I'll go on and answer it. It says, I understand training will be essential. Will this be through Teachscape? It is very expensive. So training is identified actually in the statute. But there will be some flexibilities. It will not have to be through Teachscape, and so we will certainly provide some feedback on some options for districts to use, but it will not be mandatory Teachscape. And then the next one is, when can we get the PowerPoint? So we will actually send this PowerPoint out within a few minutes, within 10-15 minutes after this webcast ends, and of course it's always archived, so you're welcome to share this. We're always can be found on the YouTube channel with KDE OTL. And then I think that's all the questions I have right now. And Robin, do you want to wrap it up for us?
Sure. I did want to just reiterate something that Amanda mentioned, and that is your 50/50 committee's familiarity with all of these documents that define the performance criteria.
That's
I mean,
right.
You know, we work with these documents all the time, but it seems like every time I read them, I learn something new, I see something new, there's a nuance that I hadn't thought about. And so I think to really dig into those documents at this point is really, really important, to think about this opportunity, to consider new evidences, and to think about the best way to capture evidence about the performance of your educators.
And I think another point that made me think about too is when we show the criteria and the indicators, that is not to mean you need an evidence for each individual one.
Right.
There are many of the indicators you can't do alone. It's a growth piece. That was the intention of Danielson, is to identify strengths and then areas of improvement. So when we talk about those domains, or we talk about the measures, it's a collective view of the complexities of the job. And so we just want people to be aware of the indicators, that it's not just a lesson plan, an observation, and PD, and a growth goal. It is really about the complexities of the profession. And so I just don't want people to get so granular that they feel like they have to have more and more and more evidences that aren't realistic, but really a holistic view of professional responsibility or with the environment, because ultimately we want the best for our kids.
Right.
And so I'm glad you said something.
Yeah, and the granular nature of those documents can really help you think about the growth part.
That's exactly right.
Think about exactly what is it that each individual educator might need to be focused on in the coming year, or
Absolutely.
semester. So just really spend some time working through those documents that identify the performance criteria, especially with your 50/50 committee. And just give some thought and think of it as an opportunity.
And we did have another question come in, so I want to address that. So the question was, when we talk about the documents, are we talking about the frameworks we have always used? Yes. Those are still on the web. Thank you for asking that. So it is the Kentucky Framework for Teaching, which was adapted from the Danielson 2011. Also the Framework for Teaching Specialist, or the Kentucky Framework for Teaching Specialist framework, which is also an adaptation of Danielson. It is online for under other professionals. And then the Principal Performance Standards, which is the James Strong work, is still what we are recommending at this time. And as we said before, the regulation has been approved by the Kentucky Board of Education, but now it goes to the legislative process. But those are the frameworks that have really been very well supported, and those are the documents we are referring to for to review with your 50/50 committee. Great question. Thank you for asking.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll wrap up now and just remind you of some opportunities for district support. We will continue this webcast series on November 17th. We'll have our third part of 4, and then on December 15th, both of those will be at 9 a.m. And of course, we archive just like these will. And we'll continue to just kind of peel back the layers of the personnel evaluation, the framework for personnel evaluation, and the proposed regulation. Also, just keep in mind that November is the open period for comment on the regulation. We will have face-to-face work sessions upcoming where you can bring drafts of your CEP and ideas and thoughts and work with KE personnel to think through and maybe just have thought partners as you work through that, creating that new document or making adjustments to your current one. And then we also have KDE staff, Amanda and myself, you all are familiar with us, and Kevin Stahl, but also Christine Meisberger, who is the branch manager for the Teacher and Leader Effectiveness branch, as well as Todd Davis, who's the Assistant Director for Next Generation Professionals. I know many of you speak with him on the phone. So we're always here to help you and support you as you're thinking through personnel evaluation systems. In closing, if we don't have any other questions, Amanda, are we good on that?
We are good.
Okay.
No other questions.
In closing, I just wanted to also give you a reminder that the survey window in Infinite Campus for student surveys is open. And for those of you who still have those in current CEPs, you might want to just remember that. I know many of you do them in the spring, but just a reminder that the survey window is open.
Great.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, I think that's it.
I think that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you soon.